It's amazing that you've written this book. What inspired you to take on such a broad, controversial topic as the drug war?
You know, one of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I didn't understand why. I was so little. But as I got older, I realized we had addiction in my family. And 4 years ago, when I started work on this book, I realized we were coming up to a century since drugs were first banned in the United States and in Britain. And I kind of realized that even though I thought I knew a lot about this subject, like it had been in my life all my life, I'd written a lot about it, I just realized there were loads of really basic questions I didn't know the answer to. Like, why did we go to war against drug users 100 years ago? Why do we carry on, even though so many of us can see that it doesn't work? What do the alternatives really look like in practice? And what really causes drug use and drug addiction? And I couldn't find the answers from the stuff I was reading, so I decided to go on a journey. I didn't realize how long a journey it would be when I started. I ended up going over 30,000 miles in 9 different countries. But what I really wanted to do was to sit with people whose lives had been changed one way or another by this approach and by the alternatives, and just listen to their stories and try to see how that matches the evidence. So I ended up meeting a whole range of people, from a transsexual crack dealer in Brownsville, Brooklyn, to a hitman for one of the deadliest Mexican drug cartels, to a scientist who spends a lot of time feeding hallucinogens to mongooses to see what will happen, to the only country that's ever decriminalized all drugs, from cannabis to crack, with really extraordinary results. And I guess the main thing I learned is almost everything we think we know about this subject is wrong. Drugs are not what we think they are. Addiction is not what we think it is. The drug war is not what we've been shown on our TV screens for 100 years. And the alternatives to the drug war aren't what we think they are.
Let me ask you about that. Where do you trace the actual modern drug war to its origin? What do you think was the beginning of it?
It was so fascinating going and looking through all the archives of this, and I opened the book with a story that I think tells you the real answer to that question. It's the story of how Billie Holiday was stalked and killed by the man who launched the war on drugs, Harry Anslinger. In 1939, Billie Holiday stood on stage in New York City and she sang the song Strange Fruit, which your listeners will know is a song against lynching. It was incredibly shocking. Her goddaughter Lorraine Feather said to me, "You've got to understand how shocking it was." She wasn't even allowed to walk through the front door of that hotel. She had to go through the service elevator because she was African American, and she stands in front of this white audience and she sings this song. And that night, she got a warning from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics to stop singing that song. And it seems like a weird place to start the story, because you think, well, what's that got to do with drugs? The war on drugs, the first time the phrase warfare against drugs is used, is by a man called Harry Anslinger, whose story collides with Billie Holiday's. He's the head of the Federal Bureau of Prohibition just as prohibition is ending. So he's got this big government bureaucracy with nothing to do at a time when most drugs like cannabis are legal in the United States. And he has to find a purpose for his department, and he invents the modern drug war. He's the most influential person who no one's ever heard of. And he
and a heroic racist as well. Racist as well.
Yeah, he has 2 massive obsessions. One is a hatred of addicts, and the other is a hatred of African Americans. This is a guy who was regarded as a crazy racist by the racists in the 1920s and 1930s. He used the N-word so often in official memos. His own senator at the time said he should have to resign because of it. And Billie Holiday to him was like a symbol of everything that was going wrong with America. It was fascinating to go through his writing and his files. He was obsessed with her, and he really resolves to destroy her. He hated employing African Americans, but you couldn't really send a white guy into Harlem to stalk Billie Holiday, so he employs an African American agent called Jimmy Fletcher, who stalked Billie Holiday for 2 years. And Billie Holiday was so amazing, he fell in love with her. And his whole life he felt ashamed of what he was ordered to do by Anslinger. He busts Billie Holiday, has her sent to prison. She has a horrific time in prison, but what's even worse is what happens when she gets out. You needed a license to perform anywhere where alcohol was sold. And Harry Anslinger makes sure she can't get it. So, like her friend Yolanda Bavan said to me, it's the cruelest thing you can do to a person, to take away the thing they love. They make it so she can't sing. It's really hard for her to perform anywhere. She relapses on her addiction. She ends up in hospital when she's in her early 40s. On her deathbed, when she's dying of liver cancer, he has her arrested, he has her friends turned away, he has her handcuffed to the bed. The story of, I think, how she was stalked and really killed by this man is a really important story that tells us so much about the dynamics of the drug war, how it was about race from the start and about how it makes addicts worse. We take away their ability to work, by giving them criminal records, we make them suffer more, and then we're amazed they don't get better.
Yeah, and I think that same cruelty is extended by locking up sick people and incarcerating them rather than giving them the treatment they need, especially because drugs have been around as long as humans have been around. We know that primitive Bronze Age man sucked the sap out of poppy seeds centuries before Rush Limbaugh was busted with oxy in an airport, essentially the same exact high. And Harry Anslinger's dream was to arrest every jazz singer in America on the same night. He wanted to take down Louis Armstrong and everybody else in one massive sting. It seems that the drug war, whether it be with opium in San Francisco or Harry Anslinger going after jazz musicians for heroin and marijuana, is steeped in racism.
Completely. And I think there's several things to understand about that. One is that I went to the places that have moved beyond this policy, and I think it really reinforces what you're saying about how senseless it is. I can talk about that if you like. I think it's also worth understanding what really causes addiction. This is the thing in the book. So, I went to lots of different places. I went to places that really reinforce what you're saying. I went out in Arizona with a chain gang of women who were made to go out wearing T-shirts saying I was a drug addict and made to dig graves.
Man.
People who are just
Public shaming.
degraded. Yeah, and this is happening all over the United States and across much of the world. And the thing that really blew me away is, if you had said to me 4 years ago, what causes, say, heroin addiction? I think, if I'm honest, I would have looked at you like you were a little bit simple-minded, and I would have said, well, heroin causes heroin addiction, right? We've been told a story for 100 years that's become like our common sense. We think that if you, me, and the next 20 people to walk past your studio all used heroin together for 20 days, because there are chemical hooks in the drug, our body would, at the end of that 20 days, physically need the drug, and that's what addiction is. Certainly what I believed. First thing that alerted me to the fact there's something not right about that story is when it was explained to me, if I step out after this interview and I'm hit by a car and break my hip, I'll be taken to hospital and I'll be given a lot of diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin. It's actually much more powerful heroin than Billie Holiday was buying on the streets because it's medically pure. It's not got all the contaminants that drug dealers put into it. You'll be given that diamorphine for quite a long time. Anyone listening to this, anywhere in the United States, there are people near you being given loads of heroin in hospital, right? If what we believe about addiction is right, what should happen? Those people, at least some of them, should become addicts. This has been studied very closely. It doesn't happen. You will have noticed your grandmother was not turned into a junkie by her hip replacement operation. When I learned that, I didn't really know what to do with it. It seems so weird. It's so contrary to what we're told. It's so contrary to everything we think. And I only really understood it when I went and interviewed a man called Bruce Alexander, who's a professor of psychology in Vancouver, who did a really important experiment. Bruce explained to me, the theory of addiction that we have comes from a series of experiments done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. Your listeners can do them at home today if they're feeling a little bit sadistic. You get a rat, and you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, and one is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself. So there you go. That's how we think about addiction, right? You might remember there was a famous advert for Partnership for Drug-Free America advert in the 80s based on this. In the 70s, Bruce comes along and says, well, hang on a minute. We've put the rat in an empty cage. It's got nothing to do except use these drugs. Let's do this differently. So Bruce built a cage called Rat Park, which is very different. Rat Park is basically heaven for rats. Anything a rat could want, it's there in Rat Park. It's got cheese, it's got coloured balls, it's got tunnels, it's got loads of friends, it can have loads of
It's
sex.
got jobs, it's got economic opportunities.
Exactly, and it's got and they've got both the water bottles, the just like in the first cage, the normal water and the drugged water. But remember, in that first cage, almost all the rats use it compulsively and kill themselves. In Rat Park, none of the rats ever used it compulsively. None of them ever overdosed. They didn't like it very much. Now, there's a really important human example I can tell you about in a minute, but what Bruce says is this shows that both the kind of conservative and liberal ways of thinking about addiction aren't right. The conservative way is to think, oh, it's a moral failing, you're a hedonist, you indulge yourself. The liberal theory is to think, oh, your brain gets hijacked, you're taken over by the drug. Actually, what Bruce says is it's not your morality and it's not your brain. largely it's your cage. Addiction is an adaptation to your environment.
Yes.
Perhaps a better way of thinking about it is, there's some people who argue, we shouldn't even use the word addiction, we should use the word bonding. Human beings need to bond, right? And when we're happy and healthy, we will bond with the people around us. When we can't do that, because we're beaten down or traumatized or isolated, we will bond with something that gives us some sense of relief. Now, that might be gambling, that might be pornography, that might be cocaine, but it will be something. And just to give you one human example, it happened to be happening at the same time as Rat Park that really illustrates this in an interesting way. During the Vietnam War, around 25% of American troops were using enormous amounts of heroin. And if you look at the stories from the time, people were really worried because they thought, my God, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of junkies on the streets of the United States when they come home, because they believed the old theory of addiction. In fact, those addicts were studied very carefully. They came home, they didn't go to rehab, they didn't go into withdrawal. Overwhelmingly, 95% of them just stopped. Because if you're taken out of a hellish pestilential jungle where you don't want to be and you could die at any moment, and you go back to your nice life in Wichita, Kansas with your friends and your family, that's like being taken out of that first cage into the second. I think that really helps us to understand what's going on with addiction now. We have created a society where for a lot of people, life looks a whole lot more like that first cage and a whole lot less like the second cage. And I think that's really important in terms of, and of course, the war on drugs makes their lives much more like the first cage. It cuts them off.
And if you have nothing in your life that's soothing you, you will bond to whatever you can find that does soothe you. Go ahead, Jackie.
But my question is the assumption then, I mean, what happens to somebody who is raised in a seemingly normal, nurturing family? I mean, we all have trauma behind the scenes, I'm sure, that not everybody knows about, but there are people who fall into addiction or who turn to drug use who would be surrounded by what appears to be all of the popular or the necessary accoutrements of a quote-unquote rat park, right? There are people who are raised in those environments, who have everything given to them, who still turn to substance abuse.
Well, I mean, but money can't buy happiness.
No, correct. But
Jackie, I think what you're saying is really important. And it's important to understand that this is not about poverty, right? It's not about being poor. You can be poor and have very strong and healthy bonds. An interesting thing someone said to me at one of the events I did was, well, what about Wall Street bankers? They have very high rates of drug addiction, cocaine addiction, and they're very rich. And I said, well, Wall Street bankers are a great example. Wall Street bankers are not people with happy and nourishing bonds in their life that give them, meaning and love. They're actually people as cut off as, people in a desperate situation from real sources of meaning. Now, they're not hungry, they're not, all those things. But actually, their lives, I would say, are a lot more like that first cage. An interesting way of thinking about this is to look at the societies that have acted on this. So what we've done in the United States and in Britain for 100 years is we've acted on this old way of thinking, right? And we see where it's got us. It's very interesting. Portugal, in the year 2000, had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which was kind of mind-blowing. And every year they tried the American way more. They arrested more people, they imprisoned more people. And every year the problem got worse. And one day the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and they basically said, look, we can't go on like this. We can't have an ever-increasing number of people addicted to smack in our country. So they decided to get together a panel of scientists and doctors and they said, look, you guys go away, figure out what would genuinely solve the problem, and we'll agree in advance we'll do whatever you recommend. So the panel went away, came back a year and a half later, and it said, decriminalize all drugs, from cannabis to crack, but, this is a crucial next step, take all the money we used to spend on cutting addicts off and making them suffer, and spend it instead on turning their lives around. And it's important and reconnecting them. And it's important to understand that wasn't quite what we think of as treatment in America and Britain. So they did do things like residential rehab and counseling, and that does have real value. But much more, it was about making sure that every addict in Portugal has something to get out of bed for in the morning. So one example would be, they did a huge job creation program where, say you used to be a mechanic, they'll go, when you're ready, they'll go to a garage and they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. Just massively incentivize people to employ addicts. And the results are really interesting. It will be 15 years this year. And the results are pretty clear. Injecting drug use is down in Portugal by 50%, 50%.
wow,
it's amazing.
Overdose rates are massively down. HIV transmission among addicts is massive. And one of the ways you know is massively down. One of the ways you know it's been so successful is no one wants to go back. It's reason they've got a competitive political system. They've got 5 political parties. None of them want to go back. One of the most moving interviews I did for the book, of the hundreds of people I met who had moving stories, a guy called João Figueira, who led the opposition to the decriminalization. He's the top drug cop in Portugal. And he said a lot of the things that a lot of your listeners will totally reasonably be thinking, which is, surely if you decriminalize all drugs, you'll have all sorts of problems. And he said to me, everything I said would happen didn't happen, and everything the other side said would happen did. And he talked about how he felt ashamed that he'd spent 20 years arresting and harassing drug users, and he hoped that the whole world followed Portugal's example. And to me, I think that shows you that when the one thing you can say for the drug war is we've given it a fair shot, right? We've spent 100 years, $1 trillion, hundreds of thousands of people's lives. We can look at the places. There's nothing abstract about this conversation. We can look at the places that have tried that way, and we can look at the places that have tried the other approaches. And I went to those places and I sat with those people, and you can see the results. And it's pretty striking. And it's not just addicts, exactly what you were saying earlier, John. To me, the most catastrophic result of all of this, the drug war, is the violence it creates. Because if you ban drugs, they don't disappear. They're transferred from doctors and pharmacists to armed criminal gangs. And those armed criminal gangs create an enormous layer of violence that doesn't otherwise happen. Just like, if you and me go into your local liquor store and we try to steal the vodka or the beer, they'll call the cops. The cops will take us away, right? So that liquor store doesn't need to be violent. If we go up to your local weed dealer or your local coke dealer and we try to rob them, obviously they can't call the police. The police would arrest them. So they have to be violent and intimidating in order to protect their product. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman calculated that there are 10,000 additional murders every year in the United States as a result of this dynamic. And I spent time with, an incredible transsexual former crack dealer in Brownsville, Brooklyn, called Chino Hardin, or a teenage hitman for the deadliest Mexican drug cartel who had butchered 70 people. I really wanted to understand this story. My book is told mostly, Chasing Scream is told mostly through the stories of individuals, and I really wanted people to see what that does to people on the ground. I went to Ciudad Juarez in northern Mexico. Michelle Leonhardt, the head of the Drug Enforcement Agency, a person whose wages you pay, said when she was asked about the 60,000 civilian deaths in Mexico in the last 7 years, the phrase she used was, it was a sign of success in the war on drugs. That should be a national and international scandal that she can say that. Americans are better than that. And I think that, to me, is the most... There are many disasters caused by the drug war. There's what we do to addicts. There's all sorts of things. But to me, the biggest moral horror is all this violence, which can just end. Ask yourself, where are the violent alcohol dealers now? Do the guys who work in the drinks aisle at Walmart go and shoot in the face the people who work in the local liquor store? No.
But it did happen. Less than 100 years ago. That was the reality here the last time we tried prohibition. And it's worth reminding our listeners that alcohol during colonial days and today has always been our deadliest drug in this society. And alcohol kills more people than cocaine, crack, heroin combined every year. You've laid so much on us, and I have to ask you about, I guess the biggest enemies towards any kind of progress would be those who profit from the way things are now, between the criminals, between the for-profit prison system, and also, Big Pharma is a bit of a culprit in all this as well. Big Pharma certainly doesn't want cannabis to be legalized, and we're now seeing more and more people who get hooked on Oxy, and when they can no longer afford Oxy, they're turning to heroin because it's cheaper and stronger, and in a way, Big Pharma is responsible in part for the gigantic heroin boom we're seeing in America's Midwest.
One of the most moving people I got to know for the book is a person called Lee Maddox, was a cop in Baltimore, who signed up to be a cop because one of her best friends was killed by one of the drug gangs. So she had the strongest incentive to be a passionate drug warrior, and she spent 20 years as a passionate drug warrior busting people. She knew that the police department get a lot of the budget when they seize things. The money from, it's auctioned off and they get a lot of the money. So she also benefited from that. And Lee is a really honest person, and she noticed two things. One is Lee is not a racist, and she noticed that they overwhelmingly busted African Americans, even though they're no more likely to use drugs than anyone else. And she was really unhappy and uncomfortable with that. And she noticed also something even worse, which is if you're a cop and you bust a rapist, in your town the next week there's less rape, right? If you're a cop and you bust a drug dealer, not only is there no less drug dealing, right, there's someone on the corner the next day, the murder rate actually goes up, because what you do is you trigger a turf war for control of that patch.
Yep.
And Lee realized, well, hang on, I came into this to bankrupt these people. Actually, my policy is keeping them in business. Lee quit her job. She retrained as a lawyer. She now spends her time getting the criminal records expunged of the kind of people she arrested. And more importantly, she campaigns for the one policy that will genuinely bankrupt these gangs, which is legalization. And it's important to say legalization doesn't mean, a crack aisle in CVS, right? I went to the countries that have legalized drugs. Switzerland has legalized heroin. It works incredibly well. You go to if you're an addict, you get assigned to a clinic. I went to, there are countries that have legalized and it works extraordinarily well. And we can carry on following a catastrophic model that, condemns people like my relatives and the people I love to terrible lives and causes terrible lives for huge numbers of other people, or we can choose an approach based on love and compassion that really turns people's lives around.
Well, I have to say, I support legalization of all drugs, but only because I really want to see what the commercials would be like. But before I let you go, and again, Johann Hari, this is just one of the many reasons why Chasing the Scream could be the best book ever written about the drug war. It will change the way you view the drug war, the way you view addiction. We are now, of course, beginning our presidential campaign season in America, which here lasts 7 seasons. But I'm curious, what would you be most encouraged to hear on a policy level from the candidates of both sides, especially since it does seem like Rand Paul is walking away from his former anti-drug war stance? What should American voters who care about this issue, who care about the wastefulness of it and the violence of it and the destroying of communities, what should they want to hear from these candidates?
They should be telling the politicians what to say, not waiting for the politicians to say it. These things only ever change when there are organized mass movements of people demanding it. I tell the story in the book of a homeless street addict in Vancouver called Bud Osborne, who didn't wait for any leaders. He started an uprising of organized drug users in Vancouver that has led to the transformation of Canadian drug laws. And actually I think he's one of the most heroic people I've ever met. He didn't, they had a terrible right-wing mayor. They stalked that right-wing mayor for ages. They campaigned. In the end, the right-wing mayor had to listen. He, in fact, opened a safe injecting room. That the right-wing mayor now says it's one of the proudest things he ever did. He would never have done that if there hadn't been citizens organizing and demanding it. That's how it happens. If you think about, 1969, right? 20 drag queens at the Stonewall Inn, after 2,000 years of gay people being persecuted relentlessly, said, you know what, you're not going to do this to us anymore, right? If you had stood outside the Stonewall Inn that day and you had said, 43 years from now, a president of the United States in his second inaugural address is going to name this as one of the great moments in American history, it would have, and it will get the biggest cheer from the crowd that day. Oh, and by the way, that president will be black. It would have seemed like the most ludicrous science fiction you can ever imagine. It happened because they didn't wait for a leader, and they didn't wait for. If they waited for politicians, we'd be waiting 1,000 years. What they did is they organized. Lots of brave, ordinary people organized and demanded it. And anyone listening to this, the Drug Policy Alliance, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, actually on the website chasingthescream.com, I list the organizations you can join. If you're waiting for politicians, we'll wait 1,000 years. Rand Paul believes I wouldn't vote for him for as an American citizen, but Rand Paul believes the right things on this. But the movement isn't there to make him good.
Yeah, you're right.
And at the end of the day, they'll all be only as good as we make them, and they'll only be good if there's a really consistent, organized movement that will shout louder than all the forces you mentioned, the private prison industry and all the people who profit from this catastrophic war.
Johann Hari, it is a pleasure to hear you, but it's an even greater pleasure to read you. Chasing the Scream, The First and Last Days of the War on Drugs is the book. Johann Hari is the man, and I thank you. And you are the man, by the way, for researching this and giving 3 years of your life to make this book. Please, when you're in New York, come join us in studio. We'll do an hour in person on this subject and on the book.
Brilliant.
And I thank you for your service to the human race. We'll be right back with...
Just plug
Go ahead.
The website, chasingthescream.com. Thanks.
Please check it out.
I spend my days in longing. You know it's you that I am longing. Oh, I tell